Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Dirk Smillie is with us. Dirk is a former editor at Forbes who's written a fascinating biography of Harry Guggenheim. Harry Guggenheim was a man for all seasons. The book is entitled The Business of Tomorrow. Born to a fortune in copper, Guggenheim was a true visionary. He became a philanthropist, a diplomat. He was our ambassador to Cuba for almost 4 years, a horseman, an influential newspaper publisher, and a pioneer in the development of commercial aviation and rocketry in close collaboration with the legendary Charles Lindbergh. And of course, he guided to completion the design and construction of the iconic Guggenheim Museum. I read the book and couldn't put it down. We are pleased to welcome Dirk Smillie to the program. So, Dirk, tell us, why did you come to write this book about Harry Guggenheim?
Well, Jim, as you mentioned, I was at Forbes magazine for about a decade, and I was on the Forbes 400 team, chronicling the richest Americans in the country. I did some investment fraud stories, but stories that I really liked doing there were about family business dynasties. And so I kind of left Forbes with that background. When I went to Wall Street, I went to Guggenheim Partners, which is a financial services firm. And I got to know a gentleman named Peter Lawson Johnston II, who was a co-founder of the firm. And at one point, we started talking about the need to have more written internally about the family history, the various businesses that the Guggenheims had been in over the years. So the name Harry Guggenheim kept coming up as I did my research. I'd never heard of Harry Guggenheim. I knew a little bit about Peggy Guggenheim. I knew a little about Solomon Guggenheim, whose name graces the museum here in New York, but Harry I'd never heard of. So the more I started finding out about his accomplishments and his leadership across different types of family businesses, I just got more and more interested in his story. And I was dumbfounded that no one had done a book on him at that point. So in this book, I tried to kind of chronicle the businesses that he was involved in: aviation, rocketry, the building of the Guggenheim Museum, a thoroughbred horse racing stable, which became the highest earning stables in the United States by the late 1950s, and then co-founding Newsday with his wife, Alicia Patterson. Newsday at one point was the most successful suburban newspaper in America. So I was curious about how he had made so many successes out of so many different disparate businesses, but then I was also interested in the public service aspect of his life. As you mentioned, he was our ambassador to Cuba for 4 years. He was an aviator in World War I and World War II. He was chairman of the Crime Commission here in New York City for a few years. And also he started a foundation, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, which today looks at the sort of the root causes of violence in human society, but they have kind of expanded out into other areas of research that have to do with race and policing, mass shootings, disinformation in the media food chain, hate speech on social media. So it's a very broad mandate, but that's one of the legacies that Harry left behind, and I think a good one.
Well, let's explore the family background for a moment. The patriarch was Meyer Guggenheim. He died in 1904, and he was an immigrant from Switzerland. And he founded this copper and particularly copper smelting business, which was global, was international. And he had a lot of children. He had 10 children, I think, and 7 sons. Only some of them were active in the business. Now, you mentioned Peggy Guggenheim. Peggy Guggenheim was really Harry Guggenheim's cousin, wasn't she? So,
True.
And her father was Benjamin Guggenheim, who went down on the Titanic. I mean, it's a fabulous family history. I mean, you should be telling me all this, but you studied it. But I read your book, and that's the source of my information. But so you have all these Guggenheims running around. Peter Lawson Johnston Jr., whom you mentioned, was the grandson of Barbara Guggenheim, and she was another relative So with all these Guggenheims, how was it that Harry sort of floated to the top?
Well, that's a great question. I think that Harry was judged to have a lot of the characteristics of his father, Daniel, who had led the family partnership, which, as you said, was the 7 brothers, all of whom were Harry's uncles, and his father, Daniel. I think Harry was the son who was most like Daniel in terms of the person who had the business acumen, the tenacity, and I think the intelligence to get involved in some of these other family businesses. Harry's older brother, Robert, at one point just announced to the family, every family has a man of leisure, and I'm going to choose that role for myself. So he sort of took himself out of the running to some degree. Harry also had a younger sister, Gladys, who would probably have been a very fine head of the family, but in those days, patriarchal bias was sort of the order of the day. So it kind of fell to Harry to take over for his father, and I think that aviation was probably the biggest impact that Harry made when you think about his various social impact investing and his various philanthropic efforts. But that really came out of a hobby that he developed shortly before World War I, and then he was an aviator in World War I, and kind of turned his hobby into something much more impactful.
Now, how did he get involved with Lindbergh?
Well, Harry first met Charles Lindbergh a couple of days before Lindbergh's famous flight from New York to Paris. Harry wanted to come down and see the plane that Lindbergh was going to fly, and he was really disappointed by what he saw because, as you probably know, Lindbergh's plane had been stripped of everything that had any weight to it. He was trying to make it as light as possible to allow the plane to have carry more fuel for that length of a flight. So Harry checked out the plane. He met Charles Lindbergh, and he felt like, this guy's doomed. He had no chance. So as we know, Lindbergh made it. And when Lindbergh came back, he looked up Harry, and they hit it off immediately. I think they had a lot of things in common. They were both Republicans. They both were kind of cerebral by nature, but they both had this passion for aviation. And I think they also kind of recognized a sort of inverse relationship to power that they had, meaning Lindbergh was the most famous man on earth at that point, but he didn't care about getting rich. Harry was already rich and didn't really care that much about being famous. So I think the two of them realized that with Harry's wealth and Lindbergh's fame, that's a pretty powerful combination. And they applied that in the efforts that they made to roll out aviation in the United States.
Well, was Harry the funder for the Spirit of St. Louis for the Lindbergh flight?
No, he wasn't. Harry would have been a natural person to go to for funding, but at that point, Lindbergh had already had some backers back in St. Louis, financial backers that paid for the construction of the plane. Also, Harry would not have funded that flight, even if Lindbergh had asked him, because he felt that it was just too dangerous. 4 people had died in the previous weeks attempting the same trip, and Harry had said publicly that it was not something that he was interested in bankrolling.
Now, Harry had a huge estate on the North Shore of Long Island, which was called Falaise, and Lindbergh lived there for some period of time, didn't he?
Yeah, he was kind of an unofficial house guest of Harry and his wife Carol at the time.
Harry had 3 wives.
That's right. That's right. And so at that point, Harry was with his second wife, Carolyn Morton. And Lindbergh loved Falaise. It got him away from the traveling press corps that was constantly hounding him every place that he went. And at one point, he was actually planning to build a home on Harry's property, basically next door to Harry. And that changed as time went on when Lindbergh started making these trips to Germany and was a guest of the German state, and he became so enamored with German culture at the time that he was actually planning to move to Berlin, which
to live.
to live.
with his wife Anne.
Exactly.
But
yeah.
that was after the famous Lindbergh baby kidnapping, wasn't it?
That's true.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was 1932. The Lindbergh's first child was kidnapped and then later found dead. Lindbergh and Anne Morrow would come over to Falaise. I think it was kind of a sort of a respite for them. And Harry was very welcoming. I mean, I think it sort of helped to develop the strength of their relationship. But then Harry would also dispense advice to the Lindberghs along the lines of, try to get over this problem you have with the press. Try to, kind of adopt more of a Zen-like approach where try not to let it affect you. And they would have a lot of sort of conversations, acrimonious conversations about the Lindberghs' public image with Harry. And I don't think they ever really took his advice all that seriously. But those were some of the conversations that they had when they were together, apart from aviation, which is probably the thing that they talked about the most.
Now, the Guggenheims were a Jewish family, weren't they?
Yep.
What is known about Harry's Jewish identity?
Well, that was a puzzlement to many people in the press at the time, particularly around the time that Harry became ambassador to Cuba, because he was a member of Temple
He was appointed by
Emmanuel.
Herbert Hoover.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
He was a member of Temple Emmanuel, you said.
He was a member of Temple Emmanuel, but he wasn't much of a practicing Jew. And his second and his third wives were both Gentiles. And, you mentioned Harry's home, Falaise, which you can tour today. And it's set up exactly like, in the fashion that Harry lived there when he was alive. But if you walk through that house, you will not see any reference to Judaica or, any menorahs or, anything that would suggest a Jewish person once lived here. So I think like a lot of Guggenheims, Harry did not want to be a hyphenated American, so to speak. He wanted to sort of acclimate to the culture, and his Jewish identity was not a strong part of who he was.
Was that true of the entire Guggenheim family, or did it vary from brother to brother?
It did, and I think Harry's parents were, for example, they were very involved in Temple Emmanuel. Harry's mother ran a number of committees at the temple, and they felt differently, but I think that they had no trouble with their kids and their grandkids going to Catholic day schools or choosing a different path, which most of them did.
Now, of course, Lindbergh went to Germany, met with Göring, and came back raving about the strength of the Luftwaffe, said they were invincible. It actually spurred Roosevelt to start the Army Air Corps. And then he went again in 1938 and was decorated by the Nazi government. And how did that sit with Guggenheim?
Well, there were some members of the family that were outraged by all these antics. Harry, I think, separated Lindbergh's public image from his private relationship with him. And Harry certainly felt differently than Lindbergh did about the role of the United States in the war in Europe. Lindbergh was a non-interventionist, and that was actually the sentiment of most people in the country at the time. But Harry felt differently. He never spoke out against Lindbergh, and whatever private feelings he had opposing his good friend Charles Lindbergh with regard to Lindbergh's position on the war or his kind of incendiary statements about Jews, Harry never said anything publicly about that. But privately, their voluminous correspondence in the years leading up to the United States going into World War II dwindled. That might be one mark or one measure of their kind of a cooling in their relationship. But I interviewed Reeve Lindbergh, Lindbergh's youngest daughter, about this, and she felt that there was a lot of things that Harry objected to during the in the run-up to the war, that in terms of public sentiment that Lindbergh had made, but at the end of the day, it didn't destroy their relationship, and so they had a very strong relationship after the war that continued for the next couple of decades.
Well, certainly there's some evidence the other way, because Charles Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh had, as you said, were planning to live in Berlin to escape the glare of publicity in the United States after the kidnapping.
Yeah.
But then shortly after he received the medal, there was Kristallnacht, and they decided not to live there. And in fact, they came back to the United States.
Yeah.
So at least there was some revulsion toward what the Nazis were doing.
Well, you know, Albert Speer, who was Hitler's chief architect, I mean, he was put in charge of helping the Lindberghs find a home in Berlin. And even Speer could not believe that Lindbergh wanted to live in Berlin in the years 1938, 1939, given what was happening. He felt that, I mean, he actually said, you know, Lindbergh must have been unbelievably naive to think that, you know, that he could do that. Lindbergh's initial trips to Germany were well received in the press because he was bringing back intelligence on the Luftwaffe. But when he got involved with America First and started making a lot of these remarks about the role of Jews in the press in the United States and their roles as trying to encourage the United States to enter the war, that's when I think public sentiment started to turn on Lindbergh.
Well, there was his infamous 9/11 speech in 1941, just a few months before Pearl Harbor, where he not only advocated non-intervention, this was the Des Moines speech, but he said the greatest danger to this country lies in the Jews' large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. So it went beyond non-intervention. It was kind of a stereotyping of Jews as a political force and an exaggeration of their power. Now, what was Guggenheim's reaction to that? Anything other than what you've just told us?
It's hard to say because there's nothing in the record that would indicate his reaction to that particular speech. But even Lindbergh's wife, Anne Morrow, knew that it was a disaster, and she, from that point forward, she referred to that speech as the albatross, because she was the daughter of a diplomat and knew the power of
Dwight
words.
Morrow.
Dwight Morrow, exactly. And you know, Harry was a diplomat himself, and I think everyone realized what the implication of those words were, apparently other than Charles Lindbergh.
So Lindbergh came out on the wrong side of history, but Guggenheim, who was evidently on the right side of history, continued his close relationship with him.
That's true.
Now, did Guggenheim's interest in aviation extend to rocketry?
It did, and that was a pretty good bet that Harry made. He bankrolled all the experiments of Robert Goddard, who became the father of American rocketry in the United States. He was really the sole funder of Goddard for close to a decade, and so that speaks to Harry's. I think one of the abilities he had was as a very kind of talented talent scout. You know, he had a good eye for picking people who worked around him, and also people that he funded. So he kind of placed his bets in two areas when it came to rocketry. One was with Goddard, and then the other was putting a lot of money behind programs at Caltech. And so it was kind of an institutional approach and an individual approach with Goddard. And it was, I would say, other than aviation, it was probably one of the biggest impacts that Harry made with the funding that he provided to what really became the new rocket age at the beginning of or I should say the end of World War II.
Now, Lindbergh was involved with Harry in promoting and sponsoring Goddard, wasn't he?
He was, and it was really a kind of a sort of a three-way relationship where Goddard would send up his latest rocket, and it would either succeed or fail, but Goddard would always provide a report on his latest test, and then he would send one copy to Harry and one copy to Lindbergh. And so both Harry and Lindbergh would kind of confer on Goddard's most recent experiment, and all of that analysis kind of added up to whether or not Harry decided to fund Goddard again the next year. So yeah, Lindbergh was a big part of Harry's assessment as to whether Goddard was making the kind of progress that he wanted him to.
So Guggenheim was kind of an early venture capitalist, wasn't he? Investing in a startup, a private startup, and trying to micromanage it and see how his investment was doing. But Goddard's experiments in rocketry largely failed, didn't they?
Well, a lot of them did fail, but the patents and the designs that he left behind were all used by the U.S. space program as time went on. Goddard was the guy who was one of the earliest people to work on liquid-propelled rockets, and liquid-fueled propulsion is still to this day a basic principle of the U.S. space program. The same could be said of kind of multi-stage rockets. I mean, that was the whole concept of sending men to the moon. Multi-stage rockets, which continue also to be used today. So these were ideas that were pioneered by Goddard, and it wasn't really necessarily evident at the time, but as the years went on, I think NASA and many other space related organizations have understood what Goddard's contributions were and appreciated them.
Now, Dirk, you've referred to Guggenheim's experience as Hoover's ambassador to Cuba, and he was there 4 years. So we have him as a pioneer in supporting commercial aviation and rocketry, and diplomat, and also he was successful in business because he had a fine hand in the family's copper smelting business. I think it was called a Sarco.
That's right.
And American Smelting and Refining Company. But he also was a man for all seasons because he was interested in racehorses. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about Harry's career as an owner of racehorses.
That was a kind of an amazing business to start because Harry had never been in the business of racing horses. He started with one horse in the mid-1930s, and 20 years later, he had been to the Kentucky Derby 5 times. And he had a knack for picking talented jockeys and trainers. In 1959, his stables became the highest earning stables in the United States. So that was another example of kind of turning a hobby into a business pursuit. But one of the things that I think allowed him to succeed was a principle that he used in other businesses, and I think to some degree his philanthropy, that was coming up with alternative metrics to assess his businesses, not to be confused with alternative facts, but alternative metrics, looking at the pregnancy rates of his mares or, the gait of his horses as they were running by at top speed during training runs. He would find all these other ways of measuring performance that today are kind of taken for granted, but back then, bloodlines was the thing that most people looked at as being a kind of a preeminent value when it came to choosing which horse to try to develop as a championship runner. And
in 1953, the horse he owned, Dark Star, upset Alfred Vanderbilt's native dancer in the Kentucky Derby. And we could go on because he, of course, founded Newsday with his wife, Alicia Patterson, and that's a story in and of itself. And the Guggenheim Museum, his role in building the Guggenheim, which is a landmark here in our city and is considered by many the most beautiful museum in the world. But we've come to the end of our time, so I have to ask you a question.
Yeah.
And my question for you, Dirk Smillie, is what made Harry Guggenheim the innovator that he was?
I think that Harry could perceive things differently than other people. And in addition to being a good talent scout and using things like we were just talking about alternative metrics, he wasn't afraid to experiment in the businesses and the philanthropies that he cared about. He had a philosophy about his investments and his philanthropy in particular, which was the gift doesn't mean much if some of the giver doesn't go along with it. So I think in practicing that principle, he gave his time, he gave his energy, his focus. All of those human factors are things that went into his patterns of investment and of philanthropy, and I think that that made him a very different kind of investor.
He always became very much involved. So, Dirk Smillie, thank you so much for coming by, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. Meanwhile, take care, be well, and all the best. I'm Jim Zirin.